What's up everyone, Alex here. Last week when I released my review of Trinity Trigger, I was kind of approaching it from the perspective of modern action RPGs, specifically modern action RPGs with co-op gameplay, which there's not a lot of that these days. So it's through that lens that I reviewed the game. And not surprisingly, a lot of other people, including my YouTube friends, approached it from a nostalgia standpoint, more specifically from the perspective of being a fan of Secret of Mana. It's because of all of your comments and my friends on YouTube that I actually replayed through the entirety of the Secret of Mana Remake within the past week, so that way I can approach Trinity Trigger in a very different light, and to make this video for you where we're comparing the Secret of Mana Remake with Trinity Trigger. So the first thing that I want to talk about here is the AI, and I'm just going to be blunt. Both of them are dumb as rocks. I would say Secret of Mana has a little bit of an edge because of the presence of the action grid, but the remake actually completely removed this grid in favor of a whole bunch of text selections that, quite honestly, when I selected some of them, it didn't really feel like there's any sort of difference in how the AI behaved. And when you think about Trinity Trigger, there really isn't a way to control the AI. It's just gonna do whatever it wants. And both AIs from both games are just gonna hit with like really silly attacks. And so in this sense, both AIs are not great. However, the pathing is a completely different story, because in Trinity Trigger, if you venture further away from certain characters, they'll just automatically warp to your current location, so they don't get stuck in things, which is quite an elegant solution for this problem. Whereas in the Secret of Mana Remake, you really have to baby them and change those characters in order to get them to where you are, which can get really frustrating during combat. Now, both games do feature stamina, but they both function in very different ways. So in Secret of Mana, there is a meter that goes from 0 to 100% each time you hit the attack button. But the thing is that depending on when you press this attack button between 0 to 100%, that'll actually affect the amount of damage that you inflict on your opponents. So in other words, your gameplay loop is attack, wait for the meter to get as close to 100% as possible, then hit attack again, and so on and so forth. Whereas in Trinity Trigger, you have different segments that you can use to deliver high amounts of damage, which then means you'll have to disengage if you want to replenish some of that stamina up. To me, Trinity Trigger's design is actually more ideal here, because it actually creates a more action-packed experience. So definitely Trinity Trigger gets it for me here. As far as the weapon switching goes, in Trinity Trigger, in order to change your other character's weapons, you have to change to that specific character and then invoke the weapon switching menu. In Secret of Mana, however, it actually allows you to quickly change weapons for other characters merely by invoking your own menu, which is really useful. And as you might expect, if a second or third player is controlling that character, they're the only ones that can make those types of changes. So this one goes to Secret of Mana for just being flexible and allowing us to change other people's weapons. With regards to music, I think Secret of Mana edges it out for me. And maybe it's nostalgia, but there are just some incredible tunes in Secret of Mana. That's not to say that Trinity Trigger doesn't have memorable tracks, but I found the entire track list to be less cohesive. Like, if you try to picture what game they're from, it's not quite clear that these different songs belong together in the same album. But in Secret of Mana, there are certainly flourishes that kind of carry over to the different songs in that soundtrack. So definitely Secret of Mana for me for that one. With regards to the story, I think Trinity Trigger edges out Secret of Mana by a slim margin, if only because it takes advantage of the fact that storytelling has evolved over time since the Super Nintendo era, and while it's not exactly mind-blowing or original, it's certainly able to write character moments a bit better than Secret of Mana. With regards to unlocking co-op, Secret of Mana unlocks co-op as soon as you get the girl, which is your second character. Whereas in Trinity Trigger, you have to play for like at least an hour or two until you get all 3 characters. Now, that's kind of a bummer, especially if you're going to be playing with a second person and you have to get all 3 party members in order to unlock co-op. That takes quite a bit of time, and I think this one goes to Secret of Mana hands down. The dungeon design of both games consists of boxy corridors, but what's actually very fascinating about Secret of Mana is that despite that, there are different themes and various texturing that kind of give a little bit of flavor to each specific dungeon. Whereas in Trinity Trigger, every time you go into these dungeons, they have different colored walls and some challenges, but they feel very samey. It feels like you've been going through the same dungeon over and over with just different obstacles. So for me, as far as the dungeon design goes, I think Secret of Mana has this covered. The characters in both games are stylized in very different ways. The Secret of Mana Remake stylizes it in such a way that some people might call it very mobile game-like, which is low polygon, with very little shadowing in the characters. So there's no harshness in the lighting and everything that kind of make the characters pop. Whereas in Trinity Trigger, the characters are actually rendered in this modern, cel-shaded style. So the absence of realistic shadowing can actually be forgiven. And quite honestly, between the two, I prefer Trinity Trigger's way of rendering characters a ton more. And this is also another noteworthy difference, but in addition to its stylized rendering, both characters and enemies are actually rendered behind walls. So it's easier for you to kind of keep track of what you're attacking and where your characters are, which is really brilliant and definitely clinches Trinity Trigger for this specific category. And last but certainly not least is boss battles. And this one, Secret of Mana wins handily because it doesn't suffer from the health/shield bloat that Trinity Trigger has. In Trinity Trigger, you have to deplete a boss's shield before you can damage their health. And like I said in my review, while a lot of games typically have this sort of mechanic, it feels a bit tacked on and just an artificial way to prolong boss battles to make them more epic. Whereas in Secret of Mana, you saw a boss, and yeah, you don't need to be told that it's a boss. It's going to be challenging. And a lot of these mechanics are actually really fun. So definitely Secret of Mana wins hands down for me for this one. So when you tally up how many wins Trinity Trigger has and how many Secret of Mana has, they're both pretty even. But pitting them against each other and trying to figure out which one is better based off of how many points each got isn't really the point of this video. The point of this is to demonstrate how a difference in perspective can really truly make you see a game in a very different light. One of the reasons why I made this channel is because I wanted to understand why people love video games. Because I do believe that there are a lot of good games out there that were played through or reviewed with a very different perspective or want at that time. A really good example of this is Triangle Strategy, which is a very story-heavy game, with a certain segment of players expecting to be in the battles more than they did with the story of the game. And I think that's fine. And having played through the Secret of Mana Remake, I can certainly see why people are so excited about Trinity Trigger, especially for the many reasons that I've just described. Now, is it a perfect game? No, not by any means, but it's the right amount of game for people who want to capture that sort of gameplay that the Secret of Mana Remake promised. And quite honestly, as I was playing through the Secret of Mana Remake, I actually started thinking to myself, you know what? I want to play Trinity Trigger now because of this game. Or maybe the original Secret of Mana on the Collection of Mana. And maybe the Trials of Mana that was also included in that actually has multiplayer. And so, through this exercise, I've actually learned how to love Trinity Trigger. And again, I stand by what I said in my review because that perspective is just as valid. But for the rest of you who are looking for a really fun and nostalgic time that doesn't have a lot of the kinks of its inspiration, I think Trinity Trigger will be a fantastic game to play. But that being said, a lot of you are playing through Trinity Trigger right now, and I'm really curious to hear what you've got to say. Post your thoughts in the comments below and let's talk about it. Thank you very much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.